And corruption, it seems to me the question there is really the purpose of money, the purpose of financial institutions. Are they channeling money into productive activities, into activities that are for the common good, or are they being siphoned off for all sorts of corrupt and criminal purposes? So again, that's one of the things I think that came out of the session this morning. And the second theme I think that runs through the conference is the question of virtue. And virtue, of course, is inextricably intertwined with the question of vice. And what's, I think, unique about the Judeo-Christian tradition is that it always sees virtue and vice in some sort of relation. That, of course, human beings are sadly, tragically, very capable of vice. Greed, selfishness, distrust, violence, and so on. But human beings are also capable of virtue, also capable of doing good. And it seems to me that what's really important is that virtue is more fundamental than vice. We only can have a sense of vice because we already have a sense of virtue. We can only speak of evil because there's already the good. And not because we are good, but because we are made in the image and likeness of God, who is good. And so evil is parasitic on the good, as St. Augustine said. Vice is in some sense turning away from virtue. And I think it's important to realize that, because if we assume that evil is more fundamental, that vice is more fundamental than virtue, then we're in really great trouble, because then the question is, how do we ever correct vice? How do we ever get away from it? There is perhaps a natural human desire for the good. And of course, our desires can be disordered, they can take us into all sorts of wrong directions, but that natural desire for the good, I think, is what marks us out, because we're made in the image and likeness of God. And it's about very much encouraging, incentivizing virtue, rather than rewarding vice. And we have seen over the last 10 years, just looking at the economy, how some arrangements have really incentivized greed. They have really incentivized the worst of us, not the best of us. And I think these are some of the questions that will be addressed here this afternoon. So I'm hugely looking forward to hearing our speaker, Lord Skidelsky, and then also the panelists, Luigino Bruni, Luigi Gubitosi, Jean Sung, and Bishop Paul. I suggest I will introduce each speaker as they speak, rather than doing a long biographical introduction now. So let me begin then by introducing our main speaker. Lord Skidelsky was, until a few years ago, Professor of Political Economy at the University of Warwick, one of the most important English-speaking economists of his generation, particularly known for his work on Keynes, wrote a much-acclaimed 3-volume biography of Keynes, but has also written on many other questions of economics, very recently together with his son, Edward Skidelsky, a book, How Much is Enough?, which essentially tried to reflect on questions of growth, work-life balance, and the common good in light of the financial and economic crisis. And it's also a book that draws on Catholic social teaching to make its argument. So it's an enormous pleasure to welcome Robert to our conference. And I propose to give him the floor now. He's written a paper which I think everyone has a copy of. He'll now have between 20 and 25 minutes to present the main arguments, and then we'll have 10 minutes from each of the panelists, possibility of a dialogue among the panelists, and if there's still time, then maybe 1 or 2 questions from you, but I can't guarantee that. We're on a very tight schedule, and we'll have to stop at 4:45. But for now, Robert, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here and to try and open a dialogue between economics and ethics. At the moment, they speak largely incomprehensible languages, making conversation virtually impossible. I leave open the question of which ethical system economics should be talking to. All I want to say is that the thin utilitarian bridge between economics and ethics, which links the growth of gross national product to the ethical aim of reducing suffering, is too narrow, is too thin a bridge to be adequate for a good conversation. Well, so you can think of three types of ethical questions. What is just? How ought we to behave? And what is good or desirable in itself? Such questions ought not to be beyond the scope of economics. All economic choices are simultaneously ethical choices in the widest sense, because they concern both the justice of the economic system, the means by which we pursue our ends, and the nature of the ends themselves. Now, economists often claim that all they're interested in is efficiency. They may have ethical views as human beings, but these are not relevant to their scientific work. That's a claim you often hear. But of course, this is nonsense, because first of all, it assumes that economics is a hard science whose propositions are either true or false, and that just isn't true. If it were true, economics would have very little to do, because few economic propositions can be empirically refuted. But secondly, even natural scientists have become increasingly aware that they need to understand the ethical implications of their work. No economist should claim the false modesty of a technician. On tap, but not on top. In fact, technicians have a responsibility for how their technique is applied, and economics is very much on top as being, as a social science and as a guide to policy. So it's quite unacceptable that economics say that, you know, the ethical implications of our work is beyond the scope of our subject. Ethics ought to be made a compulsory part of any degree in economics. So here are a number of ethical questions which I think economists ought to be concerned with. The first one is, how far should economic growth be pushed? All right, its aim is to relieve poverty, but at what point do we feel that poverty has been sufficiently relieved, globally, of course, for us to think of other types of organization of the economy? Secondly, are there natural limits to growth? What duties there under this do we have to future generations? What contributions can economics make to the art of life as opposed to the means of life? Then the question of how ought we to behave. If economists should be made available, should be made aware of different ethical implications of different kinds of efficiency. Slave labor may be more efficient than free labor in the sense that it may cost less, but cost reduction is obviously not a complete argument for slave labor. What about child labor? Then another type of question, should we encourage the offshoring of jobs to cheap labor location on the ground that this is an efficient way for reducing poverty in our own, in poor countries, and making goods cheaper for consumers in rich countries? Can the concept of ethical consumption or ethical investment be justified? I want to stress there are no, unequivocally right or wrong answers to such questions. But economists should be sufficiently self-aware to realize that their moral biases influence the way they model economic life, and not pretend that they're a value-free science. So I'll deal with 4 or 5 of these as long as I have time to, in more particular ways. First of all, the sort of judgments economists must make. The first and most important, perhaps, concerns the justice of the capitalist system of private ownership of the means of production. That's always been a kind of moral Achilles heel of capitalism, as was recognized by Locke 400 years ago. In his two treatises on government, in 1689, Locke says that everyone has a property in his own labor. It's a phrase that's been much used. It's not entirely easy to know what he meant, but the way I understand it is if it takes 8 hours of your labor to produce a bushel of wheat, that bushel of wheat is your own property. Locke then immediately fudged this definition by admitting that existing private property rights were not available for the majority of people, but then he defended minority ownership of the soil on the grounds that it improved the productivity of production and thus afforded increased property to those whose labor had been insufficient to secure them enough property to survive. So in a way, the private property system was justified on the grounds that it enabled enhanced property rights for the majority who were not able to own any private property in the sense that we understand it. And that can be interpreted, that proposition of Locke can be interpreted as giving owners of capital the duty to provide work to everyone else on pain of expropriation. So there was a duty on the owners of private property to provide work. If they didn't, they could be expropriated. Now, economics, what does modern economics say about this sort of set of arguments? It ignores them completely. And it ignores them completely by two modeling assumptions. It's important to understand that. The first is that most economic models assume full employment. Therefore, that moral duty is simply removed. It's no longer relevant. And secondly, they assume perfectly competitive markets in which all the factors of production receive the equivalent in money of what they produce. And so that takes distribution out of the picture. So you don't need ethics in economics. All you need is some arithmetic. That, to me, is sort of just an evasion, because we know that these questions are not, haven't disappeared. They should be part of the moral reflection of any decent economist, because it lies at the heart not only of the historically contested notion of what constitutes value in an economic system, but it lies at the heart of the conflicts which have raged, which, you know, have bedeviled capitalism ever since it was started. Why do people argue about the distribution of property? Why do people argue about the justice of private ownership in the means of production if these things don't matter to economic well-being? Of course they matter. So that, I think, is a big issue. Second issue, the relationship between bosses and workers. When Keynes wrote his general theory of employment in 1936, the socialist economist Evan Durbin wrote him a letter in which he said, well, you know, yeah, it's great, all that you say about the need to increase demand and achieve a full employment level of demand. But, he said, how can you justify the freedom of employers to exercise their sadistic impulses in the control of industrial workers? In other words, Keynes had said, in macroeconomic terms, you can solve the problem of employment, but he had completely ignored the question of the relations between employers and employees. He just took those as given. Well, okay, we've made progress in that direction. Much has been done to curb any such sadistic impulses in the control of industrial workers since the 1930s. Hierarchical systems of control have been flattened, employers' rights hedged with numerous restrictions covering health and safety, summary dismissal, harassment at work, and much else. In a parallel development, the hold of patriarchy in the workplace has weakened. Women now have full access to the labour market. But in another sense, patriarchy is intact. For Locke, work in the home carried no separate rights to property. This attitude persists, and women's domestic work remains unpaid. And despite some shifts in moral understanding, the fact remains that in a private enterprise system, employers provide employees with such fruits of the earth as they decide. And with the decline of trade unions, this has become even truer than it was 40 or 50 years ago. Well, there are ways of talking about this which minimizes this problem. For example, some economists and many others, and we had this morning, believe that knowledge is the new form of capitalism, that the internet makes knowledge available to everyone, and therefore in the future everyone will have some capital. Because with universal access to the internet, capital in the form of knowledge will no longer be a scarce resource. And in that sense, the problems raised by Locke would be met by the internet. Now, anyone who believes that will believe almost anything, because it's just totally implausible, and I can go on to discuss why I think it's implausible. But on balance, economists have objected to interfering with employers' rights on efficiency grounds. President-elect Macron wants to curtail employees' rights in various ways in order to improve the efficiency of the French economy. And this is a kind of standard remedy for Europe's stagnation. But these kinds of arguments do need to be disciplined by moral reflection. The trouble with economists is not that they're hard-hearted, but their discipline inclines them to a view of efficiency which makes them forget that workers are also people. Now, another thing, and Adrian raised this in his introductory remarks, the moral value of self-interest. Economics overturned traditional ethics by turning greed for wealth from a vice into a virtue. This perhaps most directly impinges on the conversation we were having this morning. Economics offers no opposition to the greed for wealth, because the greed for wealth is the engine of progress. Now, that's completely contrary to the pre-modern tradition. In the pre-modern tradition, love of money was regarded as ethically wicked and destructive of all kinds of virtues. Of course, martial virtues were one of the chief. Societies that were too prone to luxury lost their martial virtue, and therefore they were conquered by barbarians. And so there was that attitude. Too much wealth was bad for the moral character and for the fighting spirit. But they also understood that it was bad for the community and communal ties. And Augustine had denounced love of money as the worst of men's sins, worse than the love of power or the love of sex. Now, what happened in the 18th century? The trick was to redefine love of money so as to bring it in line with utility. It made little sense, wrote David Hume, to call a vice something that was so beneficial to society as the desire for gain. The old term avarice was sidelined in favor of the colorless self-interest. And I have a quote from Montesquieu: there are few ways in which a man can be more innocently employed than in getting money. And following this lead, contemporary economics subsumes ethics into long-run utility functions. I mean, that's how it's worked. I mean, and therefore, once you have a sufficiently expansive idea of what a long-run utility function might be, then you don't have to refer to ethics any further. What you can see is that two moralities of behavior are being opposed. Individual self-interest on the one hand, and the ties that bind us to other people on the other. Both are natural, but economists should be invited to reflect on which emphasis conduces more to human well-being, or to how social arrangements might reconcile them. So I think they need to think about these things. Then another important thing that economists need to think about is the price of progress. Economics is about how the economy can be most efficiently designed as a growth engine. The logic is simple. The growth of wealth is the means to end poverty. Ending poverty is ethically good, but the ride will be bumpy. So the question arises, how much suffering is justified to bring suffering to an end? This moral issue is well understood in other fields. For example, when we question the morality of war. But economists, by and large, ignore it. So what price is it morally acceptable to pay for progress? Duncan Foley, a very important economic historian, has written, the moral fallacy of Adam Smith's position is that it urges us to accept direct and concrete evil in order that indirect and abstract good might come out of it. So, mainstream economics is wedded to some version of the price of progress arguments. If the critic points out the wrenching costs of continuous adjustment to new conditions, the economist will invite us to compare how people live today with how they lived in the past and invite us to measure progress by that difference. James Mill put the utilitarian case in a view that wouldn't seem out of place today. He wrote, the free enterprise system has its hardships, but it is the price we pay for progress and the general good. His son, John Stuart Mill, unable so confidently to excuse the sufferings of others, added the proviso that this suffering would surely be temporary. As progress advanced, suffering would no longer be necessary. But unfortunately, John Stuart Mill failed to disclose a time frame for this optimistic scenario. Herbert Spencer, another one. The sufferings of the poor were the mechanism through which society thrived. Only by rewarding the rich and punishing the poor could this remain so. So economists alert to economic injustice today will sometimes excuse it on the ground that we can't afford just social arrangements now until we're a lot richer. Scarcity demands efficiency, not morals. And of course, exploitation of children in poor countries is justified on the grounds that it will make those countries grow faster. However, this argument for postponing ethical considerations till scarcity is overcome is undermined by the fact that most economists regard scarcity as a permanent condition. So, you're never going to overcome scarcity, therefore you're never going to overcome the suffering brought about by scarcity. An interesting contradiction. Joseph Schumpeter is another of these people who justify suffering on the grounds of progress. You'll remember his famous phrase, creative destruction. But one of them is, of course, another phrase is, never waste a good recession. He was the apostle of wealth creation through destruction. Well, all price of progress arguments beg the question of what economic growth is for. Then, so two more topics, and then I will stop. The growth of cake was the object of true religion. This was a remark Keynes made in the Economic Consequences of the Peace. And what Keynes was really implying was that the means, the growth of the cake, had completely preempted the ethical question of what the cake was for. The answer which most of us would give on reflection is to reduce physical scarcity, so that most people will be enabled to live richer lives. And, but economists then have a problem of justifying the continuous growth of GDP. Because, of course, people have been struck by the fact that beyond a certain income level, people's satisfaction, average level of satisfaction doesn't grow. So this has prompted them to query the continuing organization of society to maximize economic growth. The ethics of the matter are clear enough. Growth should stop at the point when further growth no longer produces a net improvement in the quality of life. The trouble is you can't measure the quality of life. You can measure the quantity of some goods, and so the quantity of goods argument continues to trump the quality of life argument. The value of nature. This is another very interesting issue of ethical debate raised by green economics. The economistic view that nature is simply an instrument for human purposes has always provoked an impassioned reaction from poets and writers distressed at the rape of nature for the sake of progress. The green movement remains split between those who want to limit our depletion of nature for purely instrumental reasons, that is the shallow wing of the green movement, exemplified by the Stern report on global warming, and those who value nature as an end in itself, the deep wing. There is an issue here for ethicists which economics shouldn't ignore. The shallow wing of the green movement is an extension of standard cost-benefit analysis over a longer time frame, and hence with added scientific uncertainty. And its basic argument is that we shouldn't privilege our generation over the yet unborn. But of course we don't value nature purely for its usefulness. We care about the existence of the polar bear and the snow leopard for their own sake, and apart from any utility we derive from their existence. And the same is true of the vast majority of endangered species across the globe. So, should we then view the flourishing of non-human life as an end in itself, independent of any interests we may have in it, or should we view it purely instrumentally? And that raises lots of intractable ethical issues. What can the flourishing of non-human life mean? Because, as we know, nature is red in tooth and claw. Arne Nice, the original deep ecologist, speaks of an equal right to live and blossom. But who are the bearers of these rights? Are plants, bacteria, fungi, all included? Should we devote equal resources to protecting all living things? So I think these are very important ethical issues, but they should concern economists because, you know, they impinge on what our attitudes to growth. And finally, the biggest barrier to economics taking ethics seriously is the failure, shared by the liberal tradition as a whole, to distinguish between wants and needs. Needs are absolute, in the sense that, unless they're met, we die. And this is the moral argument for reducing poverty to the minimal possible level. But wants are relative and, in principle, limitless. This is the basis of the economist's assumption of insatiability and scarcity. By failing to distinguish between the two, and by placing material wants at the center of its picture, economics evades discussing the ethical value of the wants we have, and therefore thinking about systems of social organization which repress or discipline our craving for novelty and gadgets, and it also prevents them mounting a serious criticism of advertising. So those are the kind of ethical issues which economists should not ignore, and I hope by putting them into the picture, it makes possible a conversation between ethics and economics. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Robert, for a really wonderful and incredibly inspiring start to the session. This is the hardest time of the day after lunch. You call it a light lunch in Italy. For us, this is a feast. So it's sometimes hard to stay awake, but not with this sort of level of presentation that we've had throughout the conference and again this afternoon. So very, very grateful to you, Robert, for your summary of the paper. And I now would like to give the floor to Professor Luigino Bruni, who's full professor of economics at LUMSA University here in Rome. Prior to that, he was at Bocconi in Milan for a number of years, has studied in both Italy and England, and is a prolific author both of works in economics, notably on civil economy together with Stefano Zamani, but also on happiness, on relational goods and all sorts of other questions, but also a distinguished philosopher and theologian who's written, for instance, a book which is fascinating on the wound and the blessing. And it's very much about gift exchange and how gift exchange is both theological and economic. And so it gives me huge pleasure to welcome you, Luigino, and look forward to your intervention. 10 minutes is the time you have.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I just say a few words in English, and then I switch to my original language as suggested by the organizer. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Adrian, for these very generous words as introduction. Just a very short comment, quick comment to Professor Skidelsky discussion about greed, vice, and virtue. I think a very essential operation performed by Adam Smith, a classical political economist, was to transform self-interest from vice into virtue. As Albert Hirschman showed in his book, The Passions and Interest, this semantic operation to call self-interest prudence, that was a classical cardinal virtue, was a fundamental ethical operation for the moral justification of a political economy. Adam Smith wouldn't absolutely never call self-interest a vice, because in Adam Smith, in the jurisprudence, in the whole political economy of Smith, self-interest is a form of sort of virtue. I think if we don't take seriously this transformation made by the modern economists, I think it's very difficult to understand the moral justification of market economy without this sort of what Albert Hirschman called semantic operation, transforming vice into what was a vice in the past, in the pre-modern era, into a virtue. Just a comment. Now I switch to my original tongue, Italian. Io penso che ci sia un conflitto abbastanza radicale tra la virtù e gli incentivi. Quindi trovo interessante e provocatorio il titolo di questa sessione, incentivare la solidarietà e le virtù civili, perché noi sappiamo che l'incentivo ha poco a che fare con le virtù. Questa è una tesi non mia, è una tesi classica, evidentemente che risale almeno a 700 italiano ed europeo, e cioè che nella teoria dell'antropologia. Troppo veloce? Ho avuto un segnale. No? Nell'antropologia certamente tomista, quindi quella che ha retto tutto il pensiero dell'economia civile italiana, pensatori come Antonio Genovesi, ancora prima Vico, c'era questa intuizione che l'essere umano ha due forze primitive. La prima sono gli interessi e la seconda forza è la virtù. E quindi l'idea di questi autori, tutto di Genovesi, era: se voi utilizzate solo l'incentivo, quello che Tommaso chiamava i premi privati, è come se questa persona venga totalmente sbilanciata, perché utilizzare solo uno strumento che rafforza gli interessi, ma non utilizzate l'altro strumento che rafforza le virtù, e questo altro strumento era chiamato premio, che non è l'incentivo. Questa è una distinzione classica che abbiamo totalmente perso, perché il premio, secondo un libro famoso di Dragonetti sulle virtù e i premi, il premio riconosce la virtù, non la crea, mentre l'incentivo crea un comportamento che non ci sarebbe senza l'incentivo. Pensiamo allo straordinario in un'impresa. Cioè l'incentivo è creato, cioè l'incentivo crea quel dato comportamento. Io non faccio lo straordinario senza l'incentivo. Quindi è tutto estrinseco il motivo. L'incentivo è la ragione di quel comportamento, mentre il premio Nobel o il premio, pensiamo, il riconoscere a un bar senza slot machine il premio, una targa che non ha le slot machine, il premio non crea quel comportamento, cioè non si fa un articolo per vincere il premio Nobel, saremmo totalmente stupidi, soprattutto quando si è giovani, ma il premio riconosce che quel comportamento era già virtuoso. Quindi il premio rafforza la virtù e non la crea. Ora, il problema qual è? Che nella modernità abbiamo avuto un fortissimo riduzionismo antropologico, ci siamo dimenticati che nell'essere umano c'è anche questa componente di virtù, in economia almeno, e abbiamo utilizzato soltanto gli interessi. Questo ha molto a che fare, qui non c'è tempo, ma Adrian Pabst sa molto bene che è un tema su cui lavoriamo, che un ruolo fondamentale qui l'ha avuto la riforma protestante. L'etica, in particolare c'è l'etica luterano-calvinista, cioè di questo pessimismo antropologico, cioè che l'essere umano in realtà è incapace di virtù, nella sfera pubblica soprattutto. La virtù non è forte e dobbiamo accontentarci degli interessi. Quindi tutto questo racconto della mano invisibile, che è molto più antico rispetto a Smith, come sappiamo, certamente c'è in Vico, c'è in Genovesi, l'intuizione, ma non è un caso che il primo teorico del meccanismo della mano invisibile, Invisible Hand, sia Bois-Guilbert, che è un francese giansenista, e che Mandeville fosse, quello dei vizi privati e pubbliche virtù, fosse anche egli giansenista, cioè un pessimismo antropologico maggiore di quello di Lutero. Quindi le virtù non ci sono, dobbiamo accontentare, bastano gli interessi, purché qualche meccanismo, il mercato, trasformi gli interessi in pubbliche virtù. E questa visione non è mai stata quella dell'economia, diciamo, mediterranea, cattolica, civile. Noi da un po' di anni, ormai insomma una ventina, cerchiamo di dire che esiste una via latina, mediterranea all'economia, che non è la political economy di Smith, che ha la sua dignità, che ha il suo, e che ha, diciamo, in Tommaso d'Aquino e tutta la grande visione della socialità umana, la sua radice, la sua origine. E quali sono le conseguenze di aver dimenticato le virtù e aver avuto solo gli interessi? Ma come sappiamo noi, la parola incentivo viene dal latino incentivus, e l'incentivus era lo strumento, il flauto, che nell'orchestra medievale accordava gli strumenti, incentivus. La stessa radice di incantesimo, di incantatore, di serpenti, quindi l'incentivo mi porta a fare cose che non farei liberamente, spontaneamente, e quindi l'incentivo allinea, accorda, intona gli obiettivi del principale con quelli della gente che farebbe altro se non fosse incentivato. Quindi qual è l'idea di fondo? Che l'incentivo, con la sua logica, porta via la ragione del lavoro ben fatto dalla cosa, dal dentro la cosa, la porta fuori. Nel mondo premoderno una bottiglia andava fatta bene perché era iscritta nella cosa il lavoro ben fatto, e io lo riconoscevo. L'incentivo porta il motivo del lavoro ben fatto fuori dalla cosa, e io lavoro bene solo se incentivato o controllato, la stessa cosa. Quindi capite che con le virtù c'è poco a che vedere. Quindi l'incentivo produce un forte riduzionismo antropologico, dice che l'essere umano se lo paghi può ottenere tutto, Mallini, che non c'è nulla di intrinseco, perché le virtù non sono serie. Io ottengo le cose se incentivo le persone. Beh, questo capite che è esattamente una discontinuità molto forte col pensiero classico. dove si diceva le persone fanno le cose bene perché hanno una vocazione a farle bene. Il lavoro ben fatto fa parte dell'essere umano, non è legato all'incentivo. Invece noi stiamo oggi assistendo a livello di teoria economica e soprattutto teoria manageriale, che non è solo economico, molto più specifico, a un'estensione dell'incentivo a tutta la vita. Dal business, dall'impresa è uscito l'incentivo, la scuola, la sanità, l'università, l'accademia, la filantropia, cioè questa idea che io ottengo tutto e soltanto dalle persone se le pago, se le incentivo in un modo adeguato. Quindi la mia conclusione in questi ultimi minuti è, quindi io direi non incentivare la solidarietà, ma premiare la solidarietà, perché il premio, ripeto, è un riconoscimento della virtù, non è una creazione. Noi stiamo lavorando qui all'UMSA a degli esperimenti per distinguere premi dagli incentivi, in laboratorio con studenti, abbiamo fatto esperimenti in Germania, in Sardegna e a Roma, per vedere se il premio in comportamenti, in azioni prosociali è più efficace o meno dell'incentivo monetario. Il premio è simbolico, non è monetario, è pubblico, perché noi siamo convinti di dover recuperare una visione antropologica più grande, cioè gli esseri umani sono capaci di virtù per motivazioni intrinseche e non solo per gli incentivi. Questo impoverimento antropologico che negli ultimi 50 anni ha riempito il mondo è molto pericoloso perché impoverisce gli esseri umani, cioè dà una visione del lavoro molto povera, sbagliata, che non corrisponde alla realtà, perché gli esseri umani sono capaci di cose molto grandi non solo per denaro, ma anche per virtù. Quindi questa distinzione incentivo e premio è tutt'altro che antica, ma esattamente la frontiera della ricerca oggi. Grazie.
Thank you very much indeed, Luigino, for that fascinating intervention about essentially how to recognize and reward virtue, not only thinking about incentives, but immaterial symbolic ways of recognizing and rewarding virtue and solidarity. Now it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Luigi Gubitosi, who is currently Executive Commissioner of Alitalia, the airline, and has a long distinguished career in business. Also, a long distinguished academic record, studied in Italy, England and France, is teaching corporate finance today, but has, as I said, an incredible track record in business, was the Chief Financial Officer of Fiat, and also the Chief Executive Officer of Wind Telecommunications. As I said, currently with Alitalia, and bringing very much both a business and a corporate finance perspective to this. So, Luigi, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed the previous intervention. I will try to propose to my employees to get no incentives and do it out of good. Let's see how it works. It's going to be very innovative, but it may work, actually. And I will also apologize to the English speakers, because I will indeed try to speak English in my intervention. So I'll take it from a less philosophical, more practical approach to how to incentivize solidarity. Overall, globalization has been, with some nuances, a very positive event for mankind. There are less people in the world that are living in extreme poverty than 30 years ago. Less people are dying of hunger. Trade has increased not only between the G7 and emerging markets, but also between the G markets themselves. As an example, trade between China and India was 1.7 billion in 1997, and it was grown to 72 billion by 2014. Economic links between countries have multiplied. According to Bloomberg, textile manufacturers from China, Turkey and Bangladesh are investing over 2 billion in Ethiopia to open new factories. And similar investment have spurred, again as another example, the call center hub development in the Philippines. In short, trade has played a very positive role to reduce poverty and strengthen links between different countries and cultures, as has often happened in the course of history. However, in the Western world, globalization has taken somewhat of a negative connotation. Since the Great Recession of 2007, economic instability has been spreading anxiety in many Western countries. As a result, populist parties have emerged and thrived on this feeling of instability. They, in a nutshell, blame globalization both for the loss of jobs that have moved allegedly to the emerging markets and for the wave of immigrants that has swept Western Europe. And indeed, Western Europe as a society had a tough time recently. In fact, automation, more than globalization, has taken a toll on employment. Take banking jobs. Once in Italy, the ultimate secure position. People aspire to jobs in a bank. They have not gone global. They have moved to the internet. And the same is true for many retail jobs due to the emergence of the likes of Amazon. Now, if you look at the American retail, it's under the greatest difficulty in the history of commerce, losing a lot of jobs. Call it, if you wish, the California paradox. The Golden State is home to the Internet revolution, boasts the same gross domestic product as France, if independent, would rank as the world's sixth largest economy. Nevertheless, according to the recent census report reported by Forbes, it has the highest poverty level in the United States. Even where unemployment is back to the pre-crisis levels, like in the United States, unstable jobs have replaced stable ones. There are less bank clerks and more Uber drivers. There are less unions, more limited benefits, and not job stability. Social mobility has slowed down. What used to be known as the American dream is actually showing that people are moving down as much as up that social ladder today. For the first time since World War II, you cannot take for granted that your children will do better than their parents. And this is a big issue for many. It creates, as I said, anxiety. I like what Adrian said at the beginning about the importance of employment. In fact, I would add a word. When people lose employment, they lose their dignity. And where they fear for their children, they lose hope. So thus the perception of rising inequality generates uneasiness and despair among those who fell left behind in Western countries. This feeling is still possibly negligible in emerging markets like China, where the economic high tide is raising every boat. However, inequality, if ignored, will soon become a significant social problem there as well. Demography is playing a negative role in many countries as well. Smaller families and longer lives put an extra burden on welfare system. For many, aging becomes a winding road to uncertainty. In short, there is widespread uneasiness in our society, which sometimes turns into rage. Immigrants have become an obvious target of such rage. Immigration has dramatically increased over the last few years, especially in Europe and the US. But, as a matter of fact, an even larger number of immigrants move yearly across emerging markets. Refugees flee war zones like Syria, but also escape poverty. Any human being lives on projects and dreams and fights for a better future to live. Immigrants escape hopelessness. So the arrival of immigrants typically polarizes societies. Some are open towards the newcomers, others are suspicious. Particularly, they worry about security. A comprehensive policy on integration is necessary to address the needs of immigrants and social stability. And unfortunately, many governments are struggling to address this issue. Some can rely on established multicultural society and adequate policy. More needs to create their own policy from scratch. Take, for example, under the same blue flag with 12 stars. On the one hand, you have France, that has a tradition of immigration from several generations. On the other hand, you have Hungary, a Central European state that's always been socially homogeneous. Europe is in between these two extremes and finds it impossible to lead a common initiative on immigration. Italy as well is struggling with the same problem. It is on the forefront to fight against human trafficking in the Mediterranean, but it has still to develop a comprehensive policy on immigration. And immigrants are unfortunately the perfect target for populist politicians. They are easily profiled in stereotypes. They are easily associated with the threat of religious extremism. They are an easy victim to any rhetoric of us against them. When times are tough, it doesn't take much in public discourse to light the fire of racism. Social cohesion is diminishing in our society, and values are not as commonly shared as they used to be. Last century's ideologies have to a large extent disappeared, but a number of dividing lines within society are appearing which, over time, if unchecked, will cause significant damage. So how to incentivize solidarity in this complex context? Solidarity is still a significant pillar of our society. An impressive number of people volunteer to help others every day. Religious values are a barrier to rage and racism and promote cooperation and integration. Many organizations and private individuals reach out to help the weakest, the elders, the poor. So it is of paramount importance to spread this value and show the example. Media must promote real, not alternative facts. And that must apply to fiction, to movies, social media. Education to accept and cherish diversity must start at kindergarten. Promoting this value must be the main task for public broadcasting media as a catalyst for entire media sectors and society at large. In fact, among the various jobs that I covered, you failed to mention that I spent 3 years at RAI, the Italian television system, and we did try over this period to use fiction, movies, and in general what people watch with different eyes than the news as a way to promote these messages. In fact, our broadcasting policy was called "No One Excluded." So at the same time, government must promote economic growth and integration, reduce inequality, and ensure security in order to rally the people around key values. In fact, public values and public policies are not mutually exclusive. They are necessary to each other, and time is of essence. Globalization and protectionism will continue to fight each other. In time of crisis, it is necessary to remember that there is a case for arguing that, in fact, the world is getting better. Science is curing many diseases, child mortality is decreasing, many African and Asian countries are slowly climbing up the social ladder and developing a struggle middle class. People are living healthier and are more prosperous than their grandparents. We have to ensure that our society accepts changes, embraces diversity, and proactively fights fear, in order for the world, to paraphrase the title of a famous book, remains flat. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I looked at Lord Skidelsky's papers, I wanted to respond drawing on some of the observations coming from Laudato Si, partly because I think Laudato Si, with its emphasis on the environment, gives an urgency to the type of questions that are there. I really appreciated the link, the bridge, the thin bridge between ethics and economics. I want to put that bridge, I think, is on two foundations that we need to reflect on. One is anthropology, philosophy, and the other is cultural. And strangely, there's a part in Pope Francis where he says that if we're going to deal meaningfully with the questions of ecology, we can't avoid deeper questions. And these questions, he says, are ones of what is the purpose of our life in this world? Why are we here? What is the goal of our work and all our efforts? What need does the earth have of us? So these deeper philosophical questions that I think are always difficult questions, but in our present cultural context are questions that people are reluctant to address. Reluctant to address because I think recognition of the polarization that already exists around far simpler questions. I think because postmodernism has somewhat said there are no answers to these deeper questions and everybody has to do whatever he or she can to find some purpose and meaning in his or her life. And I think there's where the difficulty begins to emerge. And there, I think, is where Pope Francis says that the problems we're facing are ethical, cultural, and spiritual. The one ethical difficulty, I think he says, we don't have a vision that offers hope and a purpose to people in life. And in the absence of that, people are inclined to settle for, well, I have to do something for myself, with the risk that people become more caught up in consumerism and self-gratification. And he lays at the feet of consumerism and self-gratification a lot of the evils of our world, including the difficulties of our environment. He invites the church to be a critic of some of these myths of modernity, as he calls them. One of those, I think, is he invites us to be critical of utilitarianism. I think utilitarianism is most people's default ethical position. It's kind of practical, it sounds robustly sensible. I measure the consequences of my choices, and if there are more good consequences than bad consequences, then it's clear where I should go. And I think many people buy into it without necessarily critically engaging with its original philosophical positions. I think some of the classical critiques, one would have said, it's not as robust as it seems because our consequences are not always as predictable. And particularly if we look at environmental issues, the long-term consequences are not predictable very often of our decisions. And the danger is we live only with those that are measurable, the short term. Another issue, I think, on that one is a tendency to see the world is out there, I'm here, and failing to see that the choices I make impact not just what's outside of me, but have a consequences on who I am. The second major criticism of utilitarianism is that not all the consequences are easily commensurable. There are different types. I can make a decision that benefits me economically, but is at a disadvantage to my health. How can I trade off those issues? And I think one of the problems of that then is that people will tend to stay with the more measurable consequences, the more tangible consequences, and become blind to others. And therefore the emphasis has tended to be on things we can measure, like growth in terms of profit, in terms of consumerism, indices that we can look at and that are robustly kind of empirical. I think Pope Francis raises a number. On the profit one, he says, let's recognize that most businesses, when they measure their profits, don't have to take into account the losses in terms of the damage to environment, the losses in terms of pollution, that somebody else is picking up those costs. And even our robust measures of profits are not equitable. They're not ethically justifiable. I think the other one you identified very clearly is an issue about wants and needs. And I think it's not just that our wants are different to our needs, but that our wants are produced for us, precisely by those people who are then going to satisfy them. And particularly in social marketing, I think there's a recognition that what we sell is an image of a good life that everybody else seems to be having and that I should have, and without asking what exactly is this good life, but we produce an image of the perfect life and the perfect, beautiful people who are enjoying this life, and the rest of us are yearning for something that we know we're missing, even though we're not sure who exactly might have it. And interesting, we find that in somebody like in the critique of art by somebody like John Berger, who had this materialistic Marxist critique of the use of beauty to induce in us a desire for something that doesn't actually exist. And similarly, almost in Pope Benedict, where the beauty is perverted to sell us things. I think related to that then also, even the robust concept you brought out there of self-interest. What is my self-interest? I think, again, a more enlightened self-interest is what we see Pope Francis is saying in the light of the threats coming from climate change and from the environment. We live together in this world. There's no, the change and the degradation we see is the destiny of all of us. The increasing inequality should cause people to think if their self-interest is not in reducing those issues that lead to forms of migration that are maybe difficult to manage, and lead also to types of violence that come from the injustice that goes with inequality. I think an equal one that's just, I think, a slight thing I want to mention here is that one of the issues that's emerging quite strongly is we have people in our world today trying to almost take the individual destiny to its ultimate end And with the amount of research going on future space travel that will take the elite of the world to a better world and will help them to escape almost this sense of shared destiny. On a more positive level, I think Pope Francis builds a reply to all of these in terms of suggesting we need a spirituality. I think what that wants to say is that he's moving us towards a vision of a more objective ethical theory that focuses in on things like, as you mentioned, happiness. I think maybe the whole concept of flourishing, of fulfillment, which is, I think, moving to a more objective standard of what it is that makes us complete and fulfilled as human beings. I think in search of that, I think he recognizes very often we will convince people of an alternative way of living, not through intellectual argument, but by exposing them to a style of life that may be simpler, that consumes less, that is more sensitive to the needs of others, that supports the importance of community. And it's in the living of that that somehow the conviction comes. And that's, I think, where the virtue, how do we cultivate the virtues that people find that the value of their choices is demonstrated in the consequences at a broader level. I'm using consequences again, but in lived consequences that are more radically and personally fulfilling. I don't totally want to, I think virtues cannot be incentivized, but we live in a world where many of the virtues we would want to recognize are increasingly, there are disincentives there. They are countercultural. So how do we create a situation where at least we can begin towards moving not necessarily incentivizing virtues, if that's a problem, but at least making the living of the virtues less countercultural and maybe finding ways in which we can penalize some of the vices and the attitudes that in fact subvert the possibility of good living. I think in particular, I think of schools and families in that. How do schools and families invite younger people into a way of living that is virtuous, that will therefore be fulfilling? And I think our Christian anthropology would like to say that if we're made in the image and likeness of God, when we live in response to others, not privileging our own interests, then there is an inevitable goodness that comes with that I think will be accessible to people in different cultures. I think therefore part of what I think the Pope is also doing is trying to create a spirituality or a way of thinking about issues that are more receptive to the long term, more receptive to the interests of others, and therefore creating an environment in which politics will not be so much the slave of the short term, which corrodes its own ability to face the problems we have today. Thank you.